Absolutely.
We have 1.5 hours for this workshop. This is the West Nordic region workshop in this room here. So if you're planning on attending something about polar law or business developments and environmental protections, you should go into the other rooms. Otherwise, stay with us. We have 3 presenters here today. They each have a presentation approximately 15 minutes. So we will try to have room for a couple of questions after each presentation and then some general discussion in the end. And the first one to present is Bænda Jakobsstofu. Her presentation is about local government institutions in the West Nordic region under pressure. And I'm just going to say a little bit about you before you start. She's an associate professor in political science at the Molde University College in Norway. And she's also an adjunct professor at the University of the Faroe Islands. And in most of her research, she's been analyzing Faroese politics and policy performance. So welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I guess most of you are from the West Nordic countries. In the audience? Hello. The main focus in this presentation is on who is to be defined as competent to set the course for political actions in the West Nordic region. First, the concept of interest and competence are discussed. Then, taking the perspective from the Faroe Islands, follow 2 narratives on communication across linguistic and mental borders, and a discussion on democratic representation in the new political international organizations. The West Nordic people have long lacking bones. Here it is illustrated by Faroese fishermen in an Icelandic fjord. You may know which one, I'm not sure myself. It's from the 1920s. And here you see from a Greenlandic fjord in the 1950s. Today, the future of the West Nordic region is of global interest, as climate change in the North Atlantic may have immense negative and maybe also some positive social and economic consequences. This requires new institutional settings for policy making, as the traditional local institutions for handling civic security and sustainable use of natural resources are not sufficient to meet huge human and environmental catastrophes, or to hinder unscrupulous exploitation of the resources in the region. New institutions must be established to coordinate the different interests in a way that is accepted as legitimate and fair, also by the small nations in the region. The aim of this presentation is to unveil some impediments for West Nordic representation in these new forums. The West Nordic region consists of a huge territory, but also of the 3 nations and democracies, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes. The population are relatively small compared to the East Nordic states. Yet, it is a paradox that in political discussions concerning future aspects of the West Nordic region, the 3 nations sometimes are poorly represented or even missing. One example is the group of 5 littoral states of the Arctic Council, the Arctic 5, so-called, who exclude all 3 West Nordic countries. Another, the Nordic Cooperation of Civil Security, or the Haga process, which only involves the 5 sovereign states, not the autonomous nations, even though, as you may see, the Faroes, since 2002, formally have substantial responsibility on the security in Faroese land and seawater, a huge territory of 275,000 square kilometers. Another important fora where the 2 nations, Greenland and Faroes, have no separate representation is in EU's northern dimension. Greenland and the Faroes have been represented in the Arctic Council since it was founded, but the status has changed during the last years. During the Swedish chairmanship, we witnessed a continuous attempt by the chairmanship to demote the representation of Faroe Islands and Greenland from a visible and three-part delegation, Denmark, Greenland, and Faroe Islands, with all three flags represented and delegates from all three governments present at the table to be included and made invisible in the overarching delegation named Kingdom of Denmark. I don't know if you see, it is taped over. You see it on there. Only represented by the Danish flag. Despite continuous protest from Denmark, Faroe Islands and Greenland, and negotiations and discussions even on the highest political level, the demotion process which the Swedish chairmanship started was manifested by Canada when they took over the chairmanship from the Swedes in 2013. The exclusion of the autonomous West Nordic nation is substantiated by juridical competence. It is a fact that they are autonomous and not sovereign states. On the other hand, when it comes to other policy fields, for example, fishery regulations in the North Atlantic, the Faroes have gained rights to separate representation in international arenas. Since the 1970s, the Faroes have participated in fishery negotiations on equal foot with other fishery nations. The 1970s were a period of institutional change in Europe to the benefit for Faroese participation in international collaboration. While Denmark chose membership in the EU, the Faroes chose not to join the Union. At the same time, there were introduced new systems for regulating fishing in the North Atlantic, and the Faroes, as non-members of EU, were included in the international regime for fishery monitoring and mutual negotiations. 40 years have gone, and new challenges are to be solved in the North Atlantic. However, now it seems more difficult for the Faroes and the other West Nordic nations to become parts of the international regimes. It should be emphasized that the ongoing omission of representatives from the Faroe Islands counts merely for political bodies. Faroe scientists in fields as oceanography, marine biology, fishery, and law of the sea are relatively well represented in international research groups, amongst them also the Arctic Council working groups. The problem is omission in political institutions. So, why representation? As the Icelandic political scientist Ingólfsdóttir has reminded us, the word interest derives from Latin inter esse, meaning to be amongst. To be esse, inter amongst. And one dimension of the concept of interest goes on content, and other dimension connects to the concept of political agency on the struggle for formal presence. Exclusion of the West Nordic nations in international fora may challenge the legitimacy and accountability of the new international institutions. Also, the lack of recognition of the locals' competence to deal with the tasks in question may indeed be unwise, as the local competence on the nature forces in the region may be of great value. But the power of defining relevant competence is the privilege of the ruling regimes. Now, what do we mean by the concept competence? Above, this concept is already used in a specific meaning, used in juridical discussions on an organization's or a person's jurisdiction to make decisions. In further discussion, the concept will be used in another meaning, in a definition of Tornes as relations between people who aim to solve a task and their ability to transform knowledge to action. knowledge and skills usually are based on traditional ways of solving tasks. And in settled policies, the competence of political problem solving is institutionalized, and institutional routines make it evident which actors are going to meet and deal with a certain kind of problem, and which solutions apparently will fit best. Democratic rules will ensure the accountability relations between the representatives and those represented. Some of you may recognize the key variables in the works of March, and also the flow of actors, problems and solutions meeting in an arena. However, as Johan P. Olsen says, in unsettled polities, characterized by weak or contested institutions, accountability relations and processes are likely to be more controversial, politicized and dynamic. Events and results are the product of many hands. Multiple actors and accountability claims are activated. There are competing interpretation of proper representation. In the topical case, where consequences of new challenges in the West Nordic region are to be faced by new established organizations, the initiative takers represent settled politics. On one hand, there are the representatives from institutions in the larger surrounding states who widen their interest fields. It's the East Nordic states, EU, US, Canada, Russia. On the other hand, there are the West Nordic nations, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes, who have traditional political institutions for management of biological resources, for fish, marine mammals, birds, and for civic security. In the best of all worlds, the institution could merge, and thus new institutions representing both the West Nordic countries and the surrounding states could base their decision processes on multiple competences. However, there are tripwires, one of them being communication problems. The challenge is how to organize processes facing new challenges in the North Atlantic. Some questions are tied to level of democratic arena for political discussions and policy making, as the problem may have local, regional, and even global effects. Generally, the EU approved notion of subsidiarity, then pushing issues down to the lowest level of competence where they can be effectively addressed, also is appraised by non-members of the EU. The notions of local ownership and bottom-up resilience in handling civil security challenges point in the same direction. How then explain the exclusion of the West Nordic nations from the new political institutions? One reason may be the gatekeepers whose origin most often is from the traditional institutions on the continent, as organizational behavior is often driven by rules of appropriateness rather than calculation of expected utility. Especially Greenland and the Faroes as non-sovereign microstates risk to not be regarded as natural hearts of premise suppliers in the policy-making process for the West Nordic region. The need of innovative solutions requiring international expert cooperation and not least a capital inflow is not questioned by any party. What may be discussed is the need of traditional local knowledge and political competence on sustainable management. This competence may not be known or at least not recognized by surrounding states. Here, the external parties, as more powerful, may set aside the small nation's interest and their request for collaboration. There should be no doubt that in times to come, all aspects of competence are needed to meet the challenges ahead. Thus, it is important to create fora for communication across traditional borders. One prerequisite is the internal mutual knowledge in the group of West Nordic countries on strengths and challenges in each country. This knowledge has grown the last decades, thanks to institutions as the West Nordic Council, established in 1997. Up to the 1970s, the contact between especially Greenlanders and the people in the other two countries was poor. However, in October 1972, students from Iceland, Greenland, the Faroes, and Norway studying in Copenhagen established a committee aiming to mediate more understanding of the exceptional conditions in the West Nordic countries. The initiative came from Icelandic students responding to the ongoing cod war between Iceland and Great Britain. There were a broad range of activities. However, the project with strongest impact for future cooperation was supporting the local Faroese Fishermen's Organization in Klaksvík, Faroe Islands, in their Conference on Fishery in 1973. Here, the Greenlandic students took part as simultaneous interpreters between Greenlandic participants only speaking their native tongue and the other participants who all master some kind of Scandinavian. The opinions to Greenlandic people here in the voice of representatives from KNAP, the Greenlandic Fishermen's Organization, had never been heard by the Faroese fishermen, although Faroese had been fishing in Greenlandic waters since early 1900. The response from the local fishermen, the Faroese fishermen, was utterly content. So good to hear the Greenlanders finally expressing their opinion, as some say. Managing the language barrier was enough to enable good communication and mutual understanding on common and also conflicting interests. The West Nordic cooperation has gone further, also in writing our own history, in this book, as you may know, and a book about present challenges. This summer, there has been a group of visitors in the Faroe Islands, but this time the communication between the islanders and the foreigners has been poor. Not because of language barriers, but because of a diverging understanding of reality. Sea Shepherd's Operation Grímsson lasted for 113 days. Their aim was to protect pilot whales from being killed by the Faroese. They regard whales as being close to the same level as human beings, while the Faroese, as most others living close to nature in the north, regard whale hunting as food supply. Around 300 members, up to 60 at a time, dressed in black, decorated with skulls, organized guards in the villages where the whales are usually driven on shore. The occupation lasted from May to October 1st. The organization financed the operation with more than 3 million Danish crowns in travel costs, plus investments in expensive boats, all financed by sponsors around the world who are affected by Sea Shepherd's selective information about whale hunting. While the Faroese argument with whale statistics dating from the 18th century up to now, providing sustainability, an argument with legal framework for prevention of cruelty to animals, the representatives of Sea Shepherd media the experiences of meeting a savage culture. Their reports are illustrated with blood-stained seawater in the competition of international opinion forming. The Faroes may be the losers. The Faroese grassroots were involved in a combat on defining the truth about the hunting of pilot whales, Facebook being the main arena. Also, a couple of members of local NGO associations for pilot whale hunters, choose to meet Sea Shepherd for discussion challenged by international media. The official Faroes, however, choose a strategy of non-action. They pledged the Faroese not to provoke the Sea Shepherds, as a confrontation would be misused in the organization's media presentation. The national authorities' fear of repercussions by defending the local tradition of eating pilot whales is understandable. A bad image may start reprisals in the form of economic sanctions and boycott of Faroese fish export. Free allotment of whale meat are a good supplement to household diets, but the fact that whales presently are considered sacred among urbanized people around the world must be, if not respected, so accepted. The grassroots demonstrated political skills and loyalty to the government on this by only confronting Sea Shepherd with rational and factual argumentation for hunting pilot whales. The incidents of more dramatic and visual confrontation were few, and maybe fewer than the Sea Shepherd activists actually hoped for. The experience with the Sea Shepherd exposed an informed citizenry, showing responsibility towards the community and who are capable to political participation, I would say. However, to influence policy outcomes, production and dissemination of knowledge is not sufficient. The Sea Shepherd model is affect international opinion by the power of money and media skills. And even when these are in the hands of non-democratic ingos, they can manage to oversteer small democratic nations. The worst scenario will be that Sea Shepherd also have influence on gatekeepers' perception of the Faroes as savages. The international society must be convinced about the Faroes' competence, not only when it comes to traditional knowledge to their local nature, but also their competence in democratic participation. This is, of course, also counting for the other small nations in the north. Perhaps one reason for Canada being reluctant to include Faroes and Iceland in the Arctic Council is skepticism to claims from their self-governing regions to participate in international fora. This could be a positive trend by providing the small nations access to all international fora dealing with the North Atlantic territory. The considerations of different alternative actions on how to handle civic security as well as sustainable management of the resources could result in more relevant and effective solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe before you leave, I just think if there are a couple of clarifying questions directly aimed at Bangta before the next presentation. Maybe I will have one question because you showed this picture of how the Danish kingdom was overriding Greenland and Faroe Island, which is quite interesting. And you gave some sort of explanation for why Canada might be, but it was Sweden in the beginning. Have you some idea of why?
Well, I don't know if it's because of that Canada is reluctant. And I don't know if it is because of the Sami question that Sweden is reluctant. But it is a fact that the Sami people who live in both Norway, Sweden and Finland, they have less political influence in Sweden.
Okay, so if there are no direct questions, you'll have a chance, of course, in the end to have more general questions. Then I'm going to introduce the next presentation. And that is by Maria Akre, who is Associate Professor in Political Science at University of Greenland. And she finished her PhD in Political Science in 2009 from Aalto Academy University in Finland, and has been working as an Associate Professor since 2011 in Political Science at University of Greenland at the Department of Social Sciences. She's also functioning as the head of department at the same institution since 2012. And her research areas cover autonomy regimes in the world, island studies, qualitative methodology, and Arctic relations with special focus on Greenland. And you will tell us about the title of your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so my theme for this workshop is around cooperation in the Nordic and West Nordic context. I will maybe not so much talk about Greenland. It will be about the three autonomous regions within the Nordic context, but of course there are some references which are more related to the Greenlandic context. Just for a short historical background, why we have the Nordic Council and the Nordic cooperation. There has been a lot of discussions in the history about how to accommodate the autonomous regions within the Nordic context, the Nordic Council. These discussions started in the 1960s and also they were again coming up on the agenda in the 1980s and also in the mid-2000s. The problem has been how to accommodate these autonomous regions like the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and the Åland Islands into a cooperation between states, because the states and the statehood is of course a kind of a legal term for how to cooperate between states. And since these regions are not states, the question has been how to accommodate this into the cooperation and on what basis. What should these regions have, what kind of status should they have if they are entering as members? So this has been a twofold question about the legal stance, about statehood and international legal personality on the one hand, and the question of practicality and feasibility on the other hand, that has taken place in the discussions between the Nordic states. The Helsinki Treaty from 1962 is the kind of foundation for the establishment of the Nordic cooperation between the 5 Nordic countries, which are then seen as the high contracting parties within the Nordic Council. In 1971, the Faroe Islands and Åland Islands became members. This was actually on the initiative from the Faroe Islands. And Greenland became later as a member into the same club in 1983 because of the home rule that was given in 1979. Before that, Greenland was as a county within the Danish realm from 1953, and before that it was a colony. So there has been some developments regarding these autonomies, how to accommodate them into the Nordic context. There was a lot of discussions based on the Kling Committee in 1969 to 70 around what kind of status these autonomous regions should have. Should they be equal as the member states? Well, the situation is that nowadays these autonomies actually have 2 seats in the Nordic Council, and they also can have a desired number of representatives sent by the government to every meeting, every meeting that the Nordic Council is holding. So the Nordic Council was already established in 1952. There are 87 seats within the Nordic Council. There are no binding decisions in this forum, so it's just proposals, discussions, and negotiations around a broad range of issues like legal issues, cultural issues, social and economic issues, and also the cooperation around transport and communications, and also cooperation in the area of environment. So there are a lot of issues which are dealt with within the Nordic Council. The Nordic Council of Ministers, which was established later, has binding decisions, and here the recommendations are taking place, what the Nordic states should implement, and what kind of decisions that are then implemented within the states and also the Nordic areas, the autonomous regions. Looking then at the West Nordic cooperation. So first there was a kind of a starting point in Nuuk in 1985 with the West Nordic Parliamentarian Council of Cooperation that was then formed. This cooperation was between Iceland, the Faroe Islands and Greenland. The rationale of this was to cooperate on common problems and to conduct positive and constructive cooperation regarding West Nordic or North Atlantic issues with the Nordic Council as well as other organizations. Then this was kind of transformed in 1997. There was a new charter that was signed and agreed upon, and also coast of Norway became a member in the West Nordic Council. The West Nordic Council then meets twice every year. There is once for an annual meeting, and then once for a theme conference. And the focus is on cultural, social, political, and economic cooperation within this council. The council is also coming up with recommendations on various issues. Especially, there has been recommendations on the search and rescue area, the resources and transportation, cultural and environmental affairs, and also Arctic relations. If we move then to the Greenlandic context, we can say that there has been an enhanced cooperation also between Iceland and Greenland. There are bilateral agreements between the countries, and there is also established a Greenland-Iceland Chamber of Commerce, this since 2012, and in 2013 Iceland also established a permanent consulate in Greenland. So the cooperation has been enhancing and developed during the recent years within business, within tourism, within education, and other areas. This map illustrates also the overlapping cross-border cooperation which is taking place in the north. We have overlapping cooperation between states, autonomies, and organizations. So the big kind of dotted line which goes around the whole is the Arctic Council members. And then we have the Nordic Council of Ministers, which is the kind of second largest line there. And there is also the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, which is the small dotted line up in this northern area there. And other, the Northern Dalmatian and so forth. And the European Union is here with the kind of more yellow color in this picture. So the Nordic Council of Ministers has also observer status in the Arctic Council. And the West Nordic Council is cooperating very much with the Nordic Council, and both the West Nordic Council and the Nordic Council are also members of the Conference of Parliamentarians of the Arctic region within the Arctic Council. There has also been discussions around a West Nordic Council's Arctic strategy, this kind of joint recommendation which has been presented for the Nordic Council, and where discussions have been also around a Nordic Council strategy of the Arctic as such. We'll see if that will happen or not. We haven't seen any documents on that yet. Just to conclude, regarding Greenland then, and the international cooperation, it's the Department of Foreign Affairs which is of course responsible for all Greenlandic international matters, but also the Department of Nature and Environment is also involved in some areas, especially environmental issues. At the moment there is a kind of a political chaos or vacuum, if you like, since the former Prime Minister Aleqa Hammond was taking some taxpayers' money for her own interests, having parties and stuff. And there was a demonstration then in front of the parliament, in the opening of the parliament here in October. And 4 ministers then decided to resign. which meant, of course, that everything was kind of collapsing. So now we will have a new election the 28th of November, and it's really open how this election will go, since there are lots of these big names is out of the picture. There has been a generation shift also in a lot of the parties. So there are younger people coming into politics and also sharing the parties. So we don't really know in which direction Greenland is going at the moment. Okay, thank you.
Before you sit down,
Yes.
are there any questions you wanna ask her now before the next presentation? Some clarifying questions? Okay, I always have one question.
Yeah, right.
Because I sensed in the previous presentations from the Faroes this feeling of exclusion because you did not have full sovereignty. Since you're coming from, have knowledge of Greenland and that situation, is it the same kind of feeling there, for instance, in the Arctic Council? But you didn't talk specifically about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and that was also one of the issues why Greenland was boycotting the Kiruna meeting, because the Swedish chairmanship was just concentrating or focusing on the member states and not the autonomous regions, and and that was one reason of boycotting the whole meeting, just to kind of address a debate around these kind of issues.
So that's something that
Yeah,
both
yeah,
the nations
definitely.
share.
Yeah.
Okay, well, hold on to your questions then for the session afterwards. We will have our third presentation in this session, and that is by Eyþór Níelsson, who's a visiting scholar at the Polar Research Institute of China. And his presentation is called Report on Economic West Nordic Arctic Cooperation. And Eyþór, he has participated in the work of the Strategic Studies Division at the Polar Research Institute of China since 2011, where his main research areas are the West Nordic Arctic, Arctic shipping, and the Arctic Development Index. And he also serves as an executive secretary of the China Nordic Arctic Research Center and was a member of the 5th Chinese National Arctic Research Expedition in 2012. And he has advised governmental, private, and non-profit actors on Arctic affairs. So welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm here more in the capacity, I guess, of an advisor of the West Nordic Council. So, as you mentioned, the idea of a West Nordic Arctic strategy jointly between the three countries has been in process, and the past year I've participated in that work. One of the things I've delivered is a report on West Nordic Arctic economic cooperation, which then goes into the idea of the strategy. So first I will go through the foundation of the project and what it actually is, and then a short overview of the external drivers, which you all know, but it's healthy to remind yourself of. And then the current reality and the economic cooperation ideas, which the report and the work of the Council has been looking at. So in 2012, the West Nordic Council assembled or has convenes 2 times each year. One is the annual meeting, which is the authority for decisions of the West Nordic Council, and then you have a theme conference, which is based on a specific topic of interest to the West Nordic countries. In 2012, the theme conference was on the West Nordic geopolitical position with regards to Arctic development, and from that theme conference a recommendation was developed and then executed at the annual meeting in in 2012. So the idea to make a joint West Nordic Arctic strategy where there are common interests between the three parties has been in development since, and another sort of important factor here is that in the same resolution it was projected to the governments, three governments, that the foreign ministers should meet on an annual basis to coordinate this work. And that first meeting happened 2014, so last September in Reykjavík, where the Arctic issues was top priority on the agenda. So just to give you a short summary of the project I've been participating in then, in 2013, so 1 year ago, I went to Greenland and conducted interviews. I've also been looking at literature reviews, media, open source documents and so on, and that has resulted in a couple of academic publications as well as presentations. But the main sort of focus here will be on the presented work to the West Nordic Council. So I presented the findings of this work in a report on economic West Nordic Arctic cooperation. First at the theme conference of the West Nordic Council in January in Sandö, Faroe Islands, and then again at the annual meeting in September in Iceland. And at that meeting there was a resolution approved that next year's theme conference in January in Greenland will focus on the West Nordic Arctic strategy and how these actors can work together. Maria did a good job on showing sort of the surge in the Greenland-Iceland cooperation, but there's also been a bilateral surge in the Faroe Islands-Iceland cooperation, although it dates back a bit with the Reykjavík agreement. Then you had the consulate set up in both countries, and 2012 you had the Chamber of Commerce set up, both between Faroe Islands and Greenland and Iceland and Greenland and Iceland. And the Icelandic consulate in Nuuk was set up last year, and Greenland is currently putting up their own consulates. They have representation in Brussels and have had. Now they're present in Washington. Next up is Beijing, and then it should be Reykjavík after that. So sort of the idea behind this West Nordic strategy is that there is a common West Nordic interest in cooperating. It's within a Nordic context, of course, but these three countries, or island societies, are quite different, and that's why they were separate into another council as well to begin with. And one of the drivers as well was to look into how they can work on Arctic affairs together, and last August there was actually application sent by the West Nordic Council to the Arctic Council on observer status of the West Nordic Council, both of course in order to observe as an observer and learn, but also to get into the working groups and expanding on West Nordic interests. So my sort of focus here is on the economic situation and the economic cooperation. So what is of course of importance there is that these are very small economies and they are quite fragile. It is, however, also important to note that it's not all about minerals or large projects, but it's also about structural changes that can be done actually quite easily, and that's in well, here we identify 11 economic cooperation categories. I will go through the bold ones when it comes to fisheries, trades, transportation, energy, and tourism. And there are a lot of cooperation opportunities there that have not really been implemented. And if you, for example, look at the idea of Greenland, that around $600 million are now going into the economy from a block grant. If you look at the Greenlandic economy itself, if you go through the transportation links, if you go through how seafood is processed, Greenland could actually be quite sufficient if they would do it in a different way. So the macro factors that you also have to put in place when you're looking at this is that there is a push towards the Arctic. You have in the world, rising demography, natural resources are becoming more scarce. Climate change is has effects, and globalization is increasing at the whole. There are people coming, of course, also out of poverty and so on, that are becoming active consumers in the world. And for example, the World in 2050 by Warren Smith is a very interesting sort of outline of this, and he puts the winners as the Arctic countries as winners, but sort of the main focus here, I think, should be that the opportunities when it comes to economic affairs, of course there are a lot of environmental and so on questions that need to be addressed as well, is that the economic sort of center and opportunities are going towards the north and the east. And if you look at the investment, possibilities, for example, in the Arctic as well, Rambo just put out a very interesting report predicting that the investments next decade will be $600 billion. The bulk would go to Russia, and is going to Russia, then Norway, North America. But the West Nordic countries' share, in this report at least, would be $10 to $20 billion. And I mean, $20 billion would double the GDP of the region as it is today. So that's a very significant sort of thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to these macro factors is that the Arctic's annual economy, as it's defined, it's fairly small. It's $230 billion. Actually, all the Arctic states, except Iceland, have an annual economy that is larger than the Arctic. Finland is the second smallest, and it's well beyond $230 billion. So when it comes to these sort of developments, it's important to keep in mind that these numbers they're a bit tricky, and they can be put into different contexts that aren't all maybe that true in that sense. I've circled here the West Nordic Arctic. I'm sorry that it goes into Canada, UK. That's not the imperial intention of it. It's more my poor paint skills that resulted into that. But it at least gives a picture of the region, and it's a fairly significant, piece of the Earth. It's 1.5% of Earth's landmass, and I mean, of course, that's Greenland. And when it comes to the population, it's not that insignificant in Arctic terms. It's 10% of the Arctic population. So it could maybe have more significance within an Arctic context and the Arctic Council work and so on than it actually does. For the sort of macro factors, it's important to look at the strategic location in the North Atlantic, and also what is there. Of course, there are resources, there are proximity to markets. It could be utilized more as a service hub for the Arctic zone, Atlantic Arctic zone. And that is sort of the rationality behind this idea of a West Nordic free trade zone, which would be an important component of West Nordic Arctic strategy. Just like when the Nordic Council started to look at economic cooperation, then some 70 years ago, 60 years, then the idea of a free trade zone was one of the first things that came up, because it simply makes sense to make the regional economy stronger and increase the global export potential. But then you also always have a service base and so on. So for example, with the West Nordic Free Trade Zone, it's quite interesting to look at how that could happen. Either you make a new agreement between the three, or you extend the Reykjavík agreement, which is between Iceland and Faroe Islands. Greenland has been observatory to the Reykjavík agreement. It followed the process very, very keenly, but there hasn't really been a decision made from the Greenlandic side. And when you look at, of course, as Maria pointed out, there are now uncertainties in Greenlandic politics. There will be an election in November and so on. But if you look at, for example, the coalition agreement, which technically is still in place, the focus is on increased trade with neighbor countries and to find new markets. And it's hard, it's expensive to find new markets, and it makes sense for the three to do that in collaboration. But then you ask, I mean, why has there been little progress from sort of getting into this trilateral agreement then? And I mean, there are some ideas, of course, that, for example, Iceland would be too dominating. There might, of course, be Danish interests intact to Greenland and other factors that are slowing things down. Another interesting sort of factor with this is that if you look at the further extension of such a cooperation, it could also go into existing networks such as Efst, for example. But that's something that would take time politically and so on. But I mean, it could make economic sense, and if it makes economic sense, then things often happen. So sort of to conclude on the free trade zone before going into a sectorial review, the idea is sort of to then just streamline the economy of the three countries together in collaboration and increase the export capabilities. Seafood is an excellent example of this, and of course, I mean, if you look at the economies of the West Nordic countries, it is essentially seafood. These are export revenue, so it's not direct impact on GDP, so it shouldn't be taken as such. But it shows what the region is actually exporting. And if you look at the other Arctic countries, I mean, Norway is much bigger than the West Nordic region combined, as well as Russia is when it comes to seafood, but it's a very small component of their exports. So the West Nordic countries are dealing with sort of different economies than other Arctic countries. And when it comes to seafood and fisheries cooperation, it's very interesting to sort of look at how they have managed their systems differently, and of course these are very controversial issues that I don't really want to go into here. But when it comes to the sort of economic factor, it would make sense to search markets together, to improve production, building on each other's knowledge, and taking a common West Nordic stance towards international conflicts, as was, for example, not done in the mackerel dispute, where I mean Greenland doesn't really have even a seat at the table yet, although there's mackerel within their zone, economic zone. So these are issues that the West Nordic region would really gain from increased cooperation. And also when it comes to technical knowledge on aquaculture, which Faroe Islands is exemplary in, Iceland is learning, and Greenland hasn't really done that much on that. So there are a lot of opportunities for cooperation. This also applies to transportation. Very blatant example is that Greenland does most of its trade through Ólafur, which doesn't make any sense geographically, when it comes to geography, but that's the case. And there is opportunity to sort of make that the logistical network more economically feasible, and that's sort of a structural change decided within each country. The Arctic shipping idea is interesting, but I mean it's very hard to predict, and it's not going at the speed as some would say. But when it comes to, for example, Asia, North Europe, North America trade, that's the biggest trade routes in the world. So if you take a small percentage of that, then the West Nordic region could benefit greatly. Another component then is the search and rescue idea, and this is something that has been done very well, I would say, in the sense of the West Nordic Council. They started to look at this 2006. There was a theme conference in 2008, and the first joint search and rescue drill was done between the three countries at that time. For tourism, you actually have something called the North Atlantic Tourism Association in place, and it's been very good to market the place or the region together, and this could be a model for other industries. The last industry I want to go very quickly through is energy. When it comes to oil and gas exploration, actually Greenland has had let's just say that Greenland, Faroe Islands are light years ahead of Iceland when it comes to doing actual exploration, and Norway is, of course, I mean, if you want to do oil and gas, you should look at them as the model for many things. When it comes to the energy systems of the West Nordic Council region, you have immense renewables opportunities that you could then take down to, for example, Europe or North America, but unfortunately I don't really have time to go through that. So sort of to conclude, you of course have a region with a lot of tangible resources, but it has to be knowledge-based, and it has to be done on a basis of the region's interests and in cooperation with international partners, because the region doesn't have the funding capacity it needs and so on. A free trade zone would bind the region more together and could be a very interesting idea, but just so I conclude as well, I'm doing a report here on economic cooperation, but for a West Nordic Arctic strategy, it's not only an economic project, it's also in the political, cultural context and so on. Thank you.